mad panicking.
Yeah, I've been waiting for this.
Back in 1994, while I was still hooked on SNES games like Mega Man X, Super Street Fighter 2, and Star Fox, I can vividly remember seeing a magazine ad for a new upcoming Donkey Kong game. And I was honestly kind of confused. I had heard of the character before, but at the time I was only 8 years old, and all I really knew about Donkey Kong was that it was a really old game that my parents may or may not have played. So with that in mind, my opinion on Donkey Kong was probably the same as most other 8-year-olds in 1994.
Donkey Kong sucks.
That was all soon to change though once I actually got a look at the game in action. I went from thinking Donkey Kong sucked to thinking it was pretty damn awesome. But before I was ever able to play the game, the thing that really got me hyped for it was a VHS tape called Donkey Kong Country Exposed, which, despite the title, had nothing at all to do with Gorillas Gone Wild, but was instead a short behind-the-scenes video about the production of DK Country. I came into possession of this VHS when it was sent to the video rental/convenience store that my relatives managed, and since they couldn't rightly rent it out to people because it was just promotional material and they knew I loved video games, they gave it to me. And I'm actually a little embarrassed by just how many times I watched this tape. Both because, as a kid, I ate up any media that had anything at all to do with video games, but also because I was absolutely enamored by what I was seeing. For those of you not familiar with this video, it featured an obnoxious host with stupid hair, going to Nintendo of America headquarters to get the inside scoop on the making of Donkey Kong Country. It showed off the, at the time, very impressive visuals, gave some insight into the story, introduced some of the characters, and even showed off a bit of gameplay. This was also the first time that I learned there was such a thing as a professional video game tester.
Alright, here we are. We're about to talk to two guys who play this game 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And guess what, folks? Guess what? They get paid.
Anyway, despite its corny presentation, there was actually some interesting information in this video. In particular, how the designers would reference the movements of gorillas at a nearby zoo when animating the characters in the game, and how all of the assets were being made using the Silicon Graphics Workstation, a very expensive piece of hardware at the time that was mostly used in film productions, but was being adapted for video games by Nintendo and other various developers such as Rare, which is a big reason why Nintendo settled on having them develop the game. They already had a Silicon Graphics Workstation in-house and were adept at using it. So the first thing that drew my and everybody else's attention to DK Country was the graphics. I don't think I'd ever been so impressed with how a game looked. Even if it's rather quaint now in 1994 when 3D modeling in games was mostly restricted to arcade games and PCs, this really stood out from the crowd on the SNES, along with other titles like Killer Instinct, which Rare was developing alongside DK Country, and Nintendo's own Stunt Race FX, which despite its flaws was a fun and impressive looking game at the time. Obviously, when converting the DK Country 3D models to the SNES hardware, they had to be downscaled quite a bit, but the resulting visuals were still something unique for 1994.
Tell you what, you better reserve this game before November 21st, because that's when it comes out in the stores. I already got mine.
The great visuals and aggressive marketing were what piqued my interest, but finally getting to play DK Country was what had me hooked on it. It was essentially a rather traditional platformer, something I was already very familiar with, basically just jumping on enemies' heads and collecting coins, or bananas in this case, on your way to the end of each stage. Beat up a boss, move on to the next area, rinse and repeat. Pretty standard stuff, really. What made the gameplay stand out though, and what made it so much fun, was that aside from the smooth controls and solid platforming, the level designs were always throwing something new at you. Whether that be elaborate barrel sections, running from a giant beaver-powered spinning wheel changing lights from green to red to keep your invincible enemies at bay, or the always awesome minecart segments, it just felt like you never really knew what the next level was going to throw at you in this game. And on top of that, DK Country was loaded with secret items and bonus levels to find, which encouraged you to really take your time investigating each stage, and take risks in the hopes of uncovering secrets that would help you along in your journey. Add on top of that the various animal companions that you could find in the game, which I have to imagine were inspired by Yoshi in Super Mario World, and factor in all of the fun side characters like Cranky Kong and my personal favorite, Funky Kong, and all of the various enemies and bosses that each presented unique challenges of their own. And what you get is a great game that was not only impressive to look at, but was also very fun to play, and still is, if I'm being completely honest. 30 years have passed, and I can still have a great time with DK Country.
When we put this out, what do you think your friends are going to think about this game?
Well, I don't think really you have to tell them all that much. Once they see the pictures, it's going to be like, you have to have it, you know it, get it.
It's one of those games you don't get bored with.
The final piece of the puzzle was, of course, the music. And this is one aspect of DK Country that I really feel I don't need to say too much about. Anyone who has ever played this game knows that it's one of the greatest video game OSTs ever, with upbeat and catchy tunes in some stages that convey the feeling of running and jumping through a wild jungle, to slow, somber, and atmospheric tracks that convey just how cold and treacherous a snowy mountain range can be, or how relaxing and dreamlike it can be to float effortlessly through the waters of Kong Island. The entire soundtrack was composed by the legendary David Wise, and I dare say it's his best work ever, and still holds up today as music I can listen to pretty much any time, regardless of if I'm actually playing the game or not. So it goes without saying that Donkey Kong Country was a massive hit for Nintendo, and it brought the character of Donkey Kong back into the public consciousness. And of course, there had to be more DK Country games to follow. There were some excellent sequels on the SNES, which we'll eventually get around to, and there were some damn good Game Boy games as well, released under the name Donkey Kong Land, in similar fashion to the Super Mario Land series. Eventually, there was even an animated series that started airing on Fox Kids in 1997, and much like Reboot, it was an early example of a TV show that consisted entirely of 3D computer animation. And for the time, it wasn't half bad, even if it did get a little weird from time to time.
Now that we're alone, how about a big birthday kiss?
Oh, yes.
You got it.
In the years that followed, there were a variety of Donkey Kong games to grace Nintendo consoles, such as DK64, which I always thought was just okay. It's a decent enough 3D platformer, but it's overshadowed by better games at the time like Banjo-Kazooie and Spyro the Dragon, at least if you ask me. After that, there were a handful of Donkey Konga games released, which I have literally nothing to say about because I've never had any interest in playing them. Eventually though, Nintendo decided to go back to basics with some new DK Country games that are pretty damn good, all things considered. They started with Donkey Kong Country Returns on the Wii, which was released to much fanfare and very positive reviews, and I personally really enjoyed this game. It's a great throwback to the side-scrolling platformers of old, but with some cool little twists of its own, and once again featuring some nice visuals and great music. That was soon followed by Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, which once again is an awesome game. It doesn't reinvent the wheel or anything, it's just a solid and very fun platformer, and I finally got to play as my favorite DK character, the always awesome Funky Kong, so it gets bonus points for that. At the end of the day though, there can be no replacing that original game. Donkey Kong Country combined the absolute best of what Rare and Nintendo could offer at the time, with gameplay, graphics, and sound that were truly unforgettable. And even 30 years later, this is still an absolute masterpiece. And to the 8-year-old version of myself, Donkey Kong does not suck.
You know something? You suck.
Awesome!